Has anyone ever stopped and thought about how bizarre racetracks are in relation to other sporting facilities? Doubtfully, since the two are seldom discussed in the same context by stick and ball sport or motorsport fans alike. Whereas most facilities utilised for stick and ball sports are relatively uniform in their construct, at least intra-league, in accordance with the strict directives and ordinance of their respective disciplines of sport, while still possessing enough uniformity between codes to at least theoretically allow said facilities to be repurposed for other disciplines of sports. Racetracks are, by contrast, bespoke constructs which are distinct not only from other sporting venues but also from each other, be they roads draped across a picturesque landscape, or erected within the labyrinthine jungles of tarmac and concrete, or even in the case of the ever-mocked circles which pepper the southern and midwestern states of the US, as well as regional towns and industrial parks the world over. Each has their own aesthetics, scopes, and characteristics to make them unique. To someone not as familiar with the world of motorsport, the need for this individuality is possibly somewhat lost, especially if what they do know about motorsport pertains mostly to a discipline which only makes use of a particular style of racetrack, such as stock car or rally racing. In contrast, the need for said diversity and individuality within, say, the levels of a video game wouldn't need this level of familiarity with the medium to understand. Visual and contextual repetition can make even the most engaged of cool loops feel tedious, and there needs to be some form of escalation to permit a player to be continually tested, and thus engaged, as their skill and understanding of the game's systems improve. This brings us to the topic at hand. RaceLeague is a simulation racing game made with Unity that includes a node-based level creation tool dubbed the Track Builder, which allows players to construct and upload racetracks to a repository, allowing themselves and the rest of the player base to conduct races against human or AI opponents on these tracks, with additional bells and whistles such as geolocation time and dynamic weather to give tracks a degree of authenticity, as the implicit goal is of these level creation tools is to make the tracks feel as authentic and realistic as possible. Using the Track Builder, I wanted to further develop my practice and procedure as it pertains to level design, and to gain further practice in translating the theories, concepts, and ethos of level design into a tangible product. I have designed levels for release projects before, but I feel that there is unfinished business in this space, things I could refine, things I could improve, things I still need more practice on. I figured this would be a useful exercise because whilst it's a fairly narrow application of level design, designing racetracks nonetheless carries a lot of the same principles and possible pitfalls as more general level design does. For one, you need to be able to direct the side of a player towards crucial information, objectives, obstacles, enemies, rewards, etc. in a way which is logical and organic to the environment that the player finds themselves in. The consensus nowadays is that objective markers cluttering one's GUI are suboptimal design, and in a case of real-world motorsport, not even an option. So much as one would have a dirt pathway become narrow and be lined with overgrown foliage to denote that you are heading towards a hazardous territory, or having clusters of in-game settlements be separated by natural geographic phenomena such as rivers, mountains, and valleys to indicate where the focus of a chapter of a story is, and what areas the player is realistically able to explore at a particular level through implicitly directing their focus rather than arbitrarily forcing these zones off into places the player will be curbstones the second they enter to explicitly discourage them. One should be able to glean where the apex of a corner is, how sharp a corner is, and various other important information needed for decision making on approach from the location of curbs, bollards, advertising road markers, styrofoam signage, runoff areas, bumps on the road, and grandstands, as these are things one would likely find on a racetrack. They're certainly not going to find a glowing line showing how and where to brake and turn. Secondly, each level and or track must ultimately be fit for purpose, i.e. they must achieve a similar degree of usability for all that use them, be that an exceptionally narrow or exceptionally broad set of variables which such introduces. Much as how one can design a level for a platformer to demand utmost precision and maximize moveset of one particular character, or an RPG title which permits distinct playstyles to allow a segment to be completed irrespective of a player's particular choice of style, a racetrack designed to host stock car, open wheeler, and prototype racing throughout the year is going to have a radically different look and feel to that of a circuit constructed for the sole purpose of hosting one round of a Formula 1. Lastly, each makes utilization of mechanisms to distinguish a basic understanding of practice from a mastering of said practice, ironically often translating to going faster in both instances, as well as punishment for a lack of understanding or failure to master the practice. There are other superficial parallels that I could make, however mechanical similarities and the similarities in how they work and what makes them good in their respective senses is what we'll be focusing on in this video. With that said, let's discuss what I was able to conjure through this exercise in chronological order. Having had a bit of a play around with the Track Builder beforehand, I decided that it would be prudent to start at a place of familiarity when it came to designing tracks in a more serious context, write what you know, essentially. It seemed a sensible enough place to start, and what I knew was Australian street circuits. Hence, the first of a series of tracks which I made as part of this exercise, set in a fictitious city in Queensland, named facetiously after a Brisbane City councillor, took a fair amount of inspiration from various pre-existing street circuits throughout the country. There's the obvious points of comparison in Service Paradise and Newcastle street circuits respectively, the location and pit lane construction. There's a homage to Townsville street circuit in the chicane which feeds into a fast sweeping corner, and a flat out King Common main straight that leads into a first true braking zone, a homage to the Albert Park circuit in the last two corners, that circuit being the source of inspiration for turns 2 through 4, as well as 4 through 6 of the Adelaide street circuit, serving the same purpose. These several homages, in conjunction with some original stretches of road, culminated into a short, technical circuit with plentiful cornering variety, overtaking opportunities, and areas which incentivize pushing the boundaries and which reward the player for their technical prowess. Satisfied with his first effort, I uploaded it to the repository and called it a day, and that was the end of that. A while later, I revisited the circuit, having done several subsequent circuits, and thus feeling that said subsequent works had left the environment design of the circuit lacking, as I'm sure you'd imagine given the footage you're seeing at the moment. Whilst inspecting the overall level, I was curious to see if there were any areas that I felt that the layout itself could be improved. As it turns out, quite a lot actually. The aforementioned turns 2 through 4 were made to be quite tight, in an effort to encourage overtaking. However, they were, in fact, too tight to allow any late braking maneuvers, given how close to the outside wall cars get taking the natural line out of turn 1, and how little space there is to brake. Any attempts at late braking could result in either understeering into the outside wall or missing the corner altogether, whereas braking earlier to try and make an undercutting maneuver will have players driving into a window of space that will inevitably close, resulting in either slamming straight into the competitor that they are dueling with, or having them clip the inside wall in an attempt to fit through the space. The subsequent corner is intended to encourage chopping and changing between lines to allow the driver that has been passed on a chance to retort. Share a similar problem in that whilst the roads are theoretically wide enough to permit such a maneuver, the corners themselves are too tight to permit this. They also don't flow that well together, causing the initial stages of a race or hot lapping to feel very stop-start and not especially satisfying. I tried multiple methods of remedying this while still intending to keep the chicane in place, but none seem to be panning out. Be it extending the straight leading into turn 2, extending the straight between turns 2 and 3, rounding off the corners, making the corners shallower, shortening the straights between the corners, nothing seemed to truly fix the problem, only mitigated somewhat or offloaded onto one particular part of the chicane. Eventually, taking heed of the advice that I'll discuss with the later projects in this video, the chicane was removed outright. The straight into turn 2 was extended and now led into a right-hand hairpin that tightens as it feeds into the bus stop style turn 3 and 4. The latter point admittedly being more of a quirk of the nodes of road placement rather than deliberate corner structure, but it does actually serve a practical purpose of meaning that an overtake coming from the inside of turn 2 will likely have their line compromised for 3, meaning that the car they overtook has a means of retort, as was the original intent of turns 3 and 4. This was not the sole issue addressed, however, as there were other problems such as superfluous chicanes, corners being deceptive about their radius and tightness, not in the fun way of rewarding those who can more effectively memorize track layouts, rather in the sense of certain corners being rookie traps, a bygone trope of level design that deserves to remain dead, and corners being at just the wrong angle to be anything more than a pace killer. Said redundant chicane was removed outright, the rookie trap corner was angled out so that you could actually see where the outside barrier was as you approached to get a proper gauge of where it was actually going. The pace killing corners had their apexes moved incrementally over to where the driver would be at the time, still requiring an adjustment of position, but not such a radical one you feel as though the back end will step out. This meant all the environmental details which pertain to the layout of the track, curbs, barriers, advertising, road markings, and even some select buildings had to be discarded, and at that point, I may as well have started the environmental design all over again, which I ended up doing. Whilst annoying at the time, I'm glad that I did, because the end result is that the track at large got a massive glow up. It feels like an actual inhabited cosmopolitan area that has significant planning going into hosting this event on its street in comparison to the previously drab and largely barren environment the previous track was placed in. Furthermore, the track is more raceable, flows better, is faster, albeit aided by the fact that it is 200 meters shorter now, and allows the AI, who typically struggle in this game to finish races, to reliably do so. While there perhaps could have been a few more details to sell that this is, in fact, right by the side of a beach, the environmental design aspect did lead to a potentially nasty habit of mine further down the road, where I would use foliage to occlude the glaring lack of the rest of civilization at the edges of the map, without considering those playing on lower spec PCs for whom this tactic would not work as effectively as the strategic placement of terrain or buildings which would be less intensive to render than individual trees. Nonetheless, if I had to pick a circuit that I was most proud of, it would probably be this one, due to the sheer turnaround which it experienced. This turnaround, however, didn't materialize from nothing. There were several other tracks made in between the first and second attempts of this track, and the latter's polish could only have been possible from the lessons I learned from said intervening circuit. Understanding the tropes and cliches of a particular medium or practice, how they emerge, and what their utility is to the overall product, is an important step in developing an understanding of a medium that will allow one to create a more exotic and subversive works, irrespective of the genre, medium, or discipline, be it literature, painting, architecture, or design, to give a few examples. The avoidance of tropes and cliches wholesale can oftentimes be as damaging to the end product as unthinkingly regurgitating said tropes and cliches, and in some cases is outright impossible to do. Avoiding one will only result in you inadvertently perpetuating another. Rather, understanding the origins and intended utilities of tropes and knowing when ones can be used without too great a concern that its presence will be too distracting, example, characters using shorthand and similes that are cliché to convey a complex concept or scenario in a succinct manner as one would in an actual conversation, when ones can be modified to garner a reaction by playing on the audience's expectations, example, having a tripe scenario in a particular genre of work play out radically different to how the scenario typically plays out, or when they should be avoided like that disease that once eradicated 1/3 the population of Europe, such as tropes which are dated or harmful to a particular group of people or have become so overdone that their presence suspends the audience's investment regardless how it is played out. This isn't some radical new information you wouldn't have heard of if you are already involved in the creative industry or a hobbyist creative, I'm aware, but it nonetheless illustrates my rationale of what I wanted Guyana International Grand Prix Circuit to be. Having tackled the practice of drawing direct inspiration from pre-existing circuits with some success, I wanted to instead address the overarching tropes and conventions of racetracks more holistically, and for this I turned to the body of work of one Herman Tilke. Tilke is a racetrack architect and engineer who, unfairly or otherwise, is often blamed for lackluster and samey racetracks currently and previously on the Formula 1 calendar, as he is the one who signed off on them, even if circumstance or the FIA's strict regulations on tracks likely exacerbated issues. He is renowned for some of the most beloved tracks in Formula 1 history. He is also renowned for some of the most bemoaned tracks in Formula 1 history, as well as a bunch that left very little impression at all or which have split fan opinion. The important thing for this exercise, however, is that both his best and worst tracks follow a fairly similar pattern. Wide, mostly flat circuits with long straights into heavy braking zones, separated by complexes entirely composed of medium-speed corners, token novelty corners which oftentimes are distinguished by having multiple apexes, and turns 1 and 2 oftentimes switching back on each other in order to encourage drivers to take different lines when in on-track duels to encourage clean side-by-side racing. Herman Tilke tracks, especially as of late, also tend to feature a corner which is conducive to neither flow nor racing but which has to be there for safety purposes, especially as Formula 1 cars nowadays are producing much of their downforce from the underbody. Launching over curbs, for example, has far more potential to cause devastating impacts at high speed than a car which generates majority of its downforce from the wings and bodywork. With these general principles, but no specific circuits in mind, what I ended up with was an almost 5-kilometer long track with 3 hairpins, all fed into from a long straight, and one of which being double apexed, 2, technically 3, chicanes, one of which is an awkward, slightly sharper than 90-degree Z shape that feeds directly into a double left-hand shoulder with 2 apexes, and an admittedly short segment of medium-speed corners that feed into the straight with the aforementioned Z chicane greeting you at the end. I didn't quite get the switchback 1-2 complex in, instead ending up with a opening 2 corners more reminiscent of the first 2 corners of the Algarve International Circuit, or Portimao Circuit as it is known, mostly because it was a more effective usage of the limited space which is available, but otherwise the circuit hits all right notes for a Herman Tilke track, barring directly lifting corners anyway. The end result is expectedly mixed, with opportunities for overtaking under heavy braking and corners that permit multiple lines, intermittent by corners which seemingly serve no purpose other than to burn up your tires on corner exit, in addition to corners which, while fast, aren't the most challenging to get right, mostly just serve to lead you back onto the front straight. Feeling that there is perhaps more to dissect with this concept, and feeling that maybe this circuit alone does not paint the whole picture, I decided to later go back into the track and make an untilkified version of the circuit. The narrative justification being that this was an older layout of the same circuit, alluding to circuits such as Fuji Speedway, which were modified by Tilke in the 2000s in order to improve safety, which you'll want to keep in mind as this comes back up later. What this entailed was the wholesale removal of all 3 chicanes, the alteration of the double left-hand shoulder into 2 corners of differing radiuses, the shortening of the straight into what is now the final hairpin, in addition to making said corner a single apex corner. Furthermore, the final corner is now much wider radius and thus considerably faster, which is further compounded by the lowering of the curbs. The result result of such modifications is that the corner entry speed is considerably higher across the board, allowing for more opportunities to pass under braking across the circuit, rather than being confined to just a few designated overtaking spots on the track. A corner entry speed also places a greater emphasis on nailing braking zones, making it much more difficult to master and thus further rewarding those who do so with exponentially faster lap times. The new complex, where the double left-hand shoulder was, is now a strangely awkward corner, as the second apex is not able to be accessed without slowing down an unreasonable amount, and is now simply a matter of limiting the inevitable understeer, unlike the greater versatility of lines afforded by the complex in the modern version. But aside from that, the layout is arguably the superior one in every single way, except for one glaring issue that I imagine you have already guessed. The fastest corner on the track has barely a car's length of runoff, meaning that simply running wide can result in a hefty incident which, considering the barriers are concrete slabs, has the potential to, in real life, result in a serious injury or worse. This lack of safety continues throughout the track. Much of the runoff for corners consists of sand traps. Sand traps, for those unaware, are sand pits which line the edge of a circuit which are meant to arrest the speed of an out-of-control vehicle that strays off the course. The reason why sand pits are suboptimal from a safety standpoint and why they were phased out in favor of gravel traps and corner aprons, the latter being something Tilke himself popularized, was the fact that they are arguably too effective at stopping a vehicle, resulting in cars either becoming beached, forcing otherwise perfectly functioning vehicles to retire from the race, or in one or more wheels being snagged and the inertia of the vehicle causing it to roll, sending debris scattering in various directions and sending the car even further out of control, not only further endangering the driver, especially in open wheel racing, but also the spectators and track marshals, potentially risking the injury or death of both. This may seem an awfully dramatic turn, considering that we are still talking about a video game with no spectators or marshals, where the player is completely safe from the ramifications of their mistakes. But it still pays to consider these things because, for one, we are aiming to make this track as authentic as possible, meaning that the discussion of how scenarios of this circuit would play out in real life are useful to the overarching design process, and for two, while safety itself isn't a big concern in a video game, ensuring that punishment for mistakes are fit for said mistakes is, and being completely total because you carried 4 kilometers too much speed into a corner isn't a fair cop, especially when that's not likely how it would play out in real life. The rest of the track doesn't fare much better in this regard. There's more to discuss with the processes of this layout, but we'd be here all day. Bottom line is that racetracks are an entity that it serves to look at holistically, lest you end up missing the forest for trees, and only dwell on how something is worse, whilst ignoring the context as to why such modifications were made. While certain design processes can and have been to the detriment of many levels and circuits alike, considering what the alternative would entail in a grounded and comprehensive fashion, rather than out of a wish-fulfilling desire for something that might not even be possible to exist, can only be a boon to one's design processes. To some, the decision to leave my first complete oval until after I had substantive basis of knowledge of the creation systems and alt-track design language may seem strange, on account of how ovals are a comparatively rudimentary form of racetrack, oftentimes consisting of 3 or fewer corners. However, such neglects the great degree of nuance that exists in oval tracks, as there are a myriad of variables from the width of the track, the distance, the angle of the banking, the quantity and sharpness of corners, the composition of the surface, presence and absence of bumps, and how each of these factors bleeds into one another, can significantly impact the skill threshold, restability, and safety of the circuit to such an extent that it could bar entire categories of competition from ever conducting events on the circuit due to the speeds being achieved, gripped, or absence thereof, or stress of both circuit places on the tires being far in excess of what is considered safe, given the kind of racing that ovals typically foster, which is close quarters pack racing. Burnie International was intended to be a pastiche of the real-world Calder Park Thunderdome, a tarmac oval in the Melbourne suburb of Calder Park that itself was based off of Charlotte Motor Speedway in North Carolina, but which was shrunken down from 2.4 kilometers to 1.8 kilometers long due to the spatial limitations of the Calder Park Raceway facility. In this vein, Burnie International is a Tasmanian oval circuit that is based on a pre-existing American oval track that got shrunken down due to spatial constraints. Albeit, instead of basing off an intermediate track known for NASCAR racing, I instead opted for a short circuit primarily used for IndyCar as my basis, in this case Worldwide Technology Raceway in Illinois, which I effectively halved the distance off to get my low-bank 3-corner 900-meter long short track. The end result is that turns 2 and 3 are considerably sharper than that of their inspiration and require either complete release of the throttle throughout the initial turn-in phase, or a tap on the brakes prior to corner entry to maximize throttle application throughout the corner, whilst adjusting the balance of the car during the slowdown so as to not understeer into the wall or into rougher parts of the surface of the track. This allows the utilization of multiple lines and styles of approach through turns 2 and 3, allowing for side-by-side racing as each different approach achieves speed at different points of the corner, allowing 2 drivers to be on hypothetically equal footing and only separated by a degree of confidence each has in their line. This, however, comes at the cost of the inverse being the case of for turn 1, which is rather single groove, meaning that there is effectively only one viable line through it. This isn't ideal for short ovals, where an integral part of racing is the discrepancies between the shortest line of a corner and the overspeed one attains from taking the wider line, and knowing how and when to effectively utilize either to make a passing maneuver or to hold position. There are other issues design-wise with the circuit. The aforementioned rough circuit towards the edge of the track somewhat mitigates the player's ability to maximize the overspeed from outer grooves through turns 2 and 3, and flat out prevents the player from doing so at turn 1. There is also a matter of the pit lane being on the back straight as opposed to it being in its conventional place of being on the front straight. The narrative justification for such is the aforementioned space limitations, forcing the designers to put it there so as to permit full fields to compete. Additionally, it does have the advantage of allowing the player a much safer pit entry and exit, as both the pit entrance and pit exit are sufficiently far away from a racing line that the player can resume traveling at full speed without fear of being sideswiped or rear-ended by a faster moving car. The problem, however, is the pit entrance is occluded by the barriers at turn 1, making it an awkward entrance and potentially preventing a player who required servicing from entering, as they might not know that it's there, or maybe nursing damage that prevents them or makes it difficult or unsafe to steer into the pit entrance. These are all things I will hope to rectify in my subsequent attempts at creating circuits, with the former being an oversight on my part and the latter being a design failing that I should have had the wherewithal to see coming. One final note on Bernie International is that it was at this point of the creation process that I became a lot more concerned with the environmental design aspect of the track designs. Up until this point, I had mostly done what I felt was sufficient to keep each circuit a center place and enough to meet real world standards regarding amenities and safety installations. However, upon viewing other people's creations and indeed when reflecting upon my own, I noticed that the environments I had created for my circuits were rather lacking. This is something that I attempted to rectify starting with Birdie International by trying to design it with the intent of capturing the vibe of a circuit that is used for grassroots motorsports nowadays, as I had described it as being such a repository. However, it would become much more imperative with subsequent projects. The Norwegian Grand Prix Viken circuit was intended as a pastiche of the Macau and Pau Grand Prix respectively. Both carry the distinction of being highly prestigious feeder series events, so prestigious in fact they are 2 of only 3 events in the world to carry a moniker of Grand Prix that aren't rounds of a Formula 1 World Championship, which, while having quite distinctive layouts and quarter complexes, are akin to both being classic events that don't actually facilitate a lot of overtaking, both due to being too narrow and too technical to really facilitate such. Instead, these events test F1 hopefuls on their precision, ability to produce one-lap pace, ability to not make mistakes, distinguishing them from other feeder series events, and for that matter other motorsporting events in general, which typically test one's ability to make overtaking maneuvers and maximize race pace. In tandem with the goal to evoke this highly unique style of event, the creation of a highly technical street circuit, I also wanted to really hone in on making this a space which seemed inhabited and lived in, which would be especially important given that the circuit was to be a street circuit, the efficacy of such somewhat hinging on the believability of its setting. In both respects, I feel I did succeed, even if admittedly from a civic engineering standpoint the layout of the mock city probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The course is a relatively short, puzzle-shaped, primarily 90-degree turn-centered circuit that makes utilization of both a major road into the industrial district and of the scenic route through gardens to provide both variety and a chance to achieve more speed than the circuit would otherwise permit. Each street is adorned with buildings and arranged in ways to make visual sense to a player as they drive past them, even if again, said group is potentially illogical from a city planning standpoint. The utilization of greenery, community facilities, and spectator areas to fill in what would otherwise be unsightly and immersion-breaking empty space is utilized to mask the fact that there are not that many buildings within this cul-de-sac, due to there only being a small selection of non-racetrack-centric assets to utilize, unsurprisingly. I also try to use assets that I would typically refrain from using in order to highlight that this circuit is temporary in nature, such as the employment of jersey barriers and guardrails in place of more conventional barricades, to having the pit lane be on the tarmac lip of a road as opposed to a separate piece of road itself, in order to further illustrate that this space is inhabited and that the inhabitants are going to need the space themselves whenever events are not taking place. Another potential issue I wanted to avert was that the track could lack flow when the majority of corners are 90-degree turns. The stop-start nature that this could have created would make the track frustrating to complete, as opposed to the intended effect of being a cathartic challenge for a player to accomplish. To alleviate this, some select corners became more rounded, and diagonal roads were placed to conjoin roads to create 2 45-degree corners with a short straight between, wherever a single 90-degree turn would have resulted in too great a loss of pace and must be deflating for a player when they have have to come to an abrupt stop for an awkward turn. While I feel I was successful in achieving both goals, my methodology was not entirely robust, and there nonetheless remains areas of improvement. With regards to the former area, when entering the pit lane or just taking a wide line through a final corner, you can see some of the garish emptiness off behind the pit buildings, which is admittedly somewhat distracting. This can also be attributed as a reason in why later projects, especially in the case of the aforementioned Angeles Street Circuit, I may have gone overboard in using foliage to cover up said empty spaces. Moreover, the node-based nature of a designer means that some of the props actually clip through barriers at certain points. These points are typically ones the player is speeding through anyway. It is only in two parts of the track, but is nonetheless an embarrassing mistake, considering the heightened attention towards the environmental details I was giving. With regards to the latter, meanwhile, there exists a dreaded blind apex within the garden section, which isn't that desirable. Blind apexes are not innately bad. Indeed, some of the most fondly remembered and renowned race tracks corners feature blind apexes. The problem in this case is that said fondly remembered corners are signposted as blind apexes long in advance and are typically either flat out kinks more than corners, strictly speaking, or they are lower medium speed corners, meaning that whilst there is jeopardy in these corners, the extent of the damage caused by an accident doesn't exceed the threshold of endangering a driver, and there is still some time to correct a mistake that isn't present in the corner and requires heavy braking to make. Said blind corner is not adequately signposted and is a heavy braking corner. The garden section ended up being tighter than initially intended due to finite space and was largely left this way in homage to the more challenging complexes of the track's main exploration, ergo it shares a lot of the problems of said corner. Be that as it may, I felt my efforts had borne through and that, if nothing else, I was pleased with the amount of progress that I was making with regards to codifying track design language, developing best practices for the various styles of tracks that I am designing. There have been several other circuits that I have made since which incorporate the learnings found herein, but for want of brevity, we'll just leave it at. The general takeaways I got from this exercise meanwhile was, firstly, how much level design ethos and principles are applicable to a seemingly unrelated field. While we are discussing racetrack design in terms of levels in a video game, given that we are designing with authenticity in mind, with realistic assets and constraints, with vehicles meant to handle realistically, and given that a lot of it was pulling directly from the real world and applying those principles directly into RaceLeague, the transferability of this knowledge, even though I evidently had an inclination that level design principle could translate to racetrack design, given that I initiated this exercise, nonetheless surprised me. What's more, it's to some extent mutual. Being able to understand what makes a racetrack challenging, what makes a racetrack flow well, what makes it possible to overtake on a racetrack can be useful knowledge to pull when designing levels as it pertains to player movement, navigation as touchstones from how environmental details could be employed to direct players' attentions, in place of GUI icons, as aforementioned. The second takeaway is of the necessity to be willing to allow all of your progress to be lost of sands of time for the sake of the eventual end product being more akin to what you wanted. Such is admittedly harder and not guaranteed success when working with an early access Unity game, as random errors can, do, and did occur, therefore meaning that it seldom feels fair but you need to discard everything and start again. And to be clear, when these issues occurred, they were usually easy fixes, but some, i.e. issues that cannot simply be removed without having ramifications of other aspects of the circuit, would require a complete start over to properly rectify, which is something that I was not willing to do at the time. Finally, there is a point to be made about how the level design process and the racetrack design process alike are very much a process of evolution, as motivations, intents, and priorities of a level change throughout the process. I have the experience of this point to some extent prior. When working on Chukin and the Space-Time Explosion, yes, that is the name we went with, I shared level design duties with the project lead, Andrew Hicken, and we had our level shift both in drastic and gradual senses, seemingly with each revision, as we were not only constantly rescoping, but constantly finding that our playtesting group was having difficulties navigating through even the primary route of the level, and weren't really interacting with the auxiliary pathways at all, meaning that they got greatly de-emphasized by the environmental design when we got to that stage of development. But while that was us reacting to an increasingly large set of data, in this case, it felt very self-initiated, as though what previously was a frustrating reality of level design is perhaps in fact a best practice that you become accustomed to performing, to develop the skills and knowledge to do so succinctly and effectively the more projects you work on. This may fluctuate from person to person, and I would like to hear what others' thoughts are on this. This seems like what would be the biggest influence on future projects. And that I think will do it for this video. If you would like to know more about the tracks, or would like to have a crack at designing your own, you can find a link to RaceLeague's Steam page in the description below. Also, if you have any feedback on this video, that'd be greatly appreciated. This is the first video I've really done of this scope, so knowing how and where people would like me to improve in the future would be great. Either way, thank you for watching and thank you for your time and consideration.